Okay, welcome back. This is the third lecture for Unit 10. This is our design concept lecture, and it may actually be the last design concept lecture for the class. I don't know how much I'll get to record for Unit 11. Um, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about the very concept of design, and I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit for you and get you to think about whether any of this design stuff is real or in what way is it real. And so the point of this lecture is got two almost exactly opposite points of view. One is I want to convince you that design is real, that things do happen in a picture, that where you place a mark matters and where you place the next mark matters and changes all the other marks that you might have put in a composition or in a painting. But I also want you to be skeptical about the way that we think about design, because the 20th century, and especially the early 20th century, the people who started the Bauhaus and the people who wrote about the Bauhaus, who wrote about other design schools, and the design thinkers of the early 20th century, they very much wanted people to believe that these were firm, fixed rules that were absolute and true. And I think that that's not entirely true either. These things are negotiable, and these things are definitely affected by convention and by culture. So, but let's start with the first point. The first point being that design is real. So take a look at this painting, which should be familiar to you, but slightly different. If you're starting to remember how it's different, right? But look at it the way it is right now, and just kind of for a moment, think about this one single red square. Think about how it fits on this canvas, and imagine that it had movement. Imagine that it was moving in some direction. What direction do you think it was moving in? Quite possibly along this corner to corner diagonal. And if it was moving in a particular direction, imagine that it also had some rotation. And if it had a rotation, what kind of rotation would it have? Now, I'm giving you a hint that one possible option is along this diagonal and rotating in this direction, but that's not the only possible way. You could see it going like this as well. But now let's look at it in its original form, right? Red square, black square by Malevich. And, and now we're like, oh, I do know this painting. And here it's changed, right? Now we can still see some potential movement, but the idea of it on a path going all the way up to there is not possible, right? The black square is in the way, and the black square, because it's almost perfectly square to the composition, and because of its location, it feels very, very solidly there. It feels like it has almost no movement, and it has a lot of inertia, and so it doesn't feel like the red square is going to pass it. Um, and so if if anything, it feels now like the red square may be more in a falling kind of motion, maybe rotating this way and falling, if it had any motion at all. But the one thing is definitely true is it's not going to continue, it's not going to rotate this way, and it's not going to move in that direction, for one thing, because the two would hit. Of course, that's assuming they're all in the same plane, which maybe they are. Let's go back to it without the black square for a second. Let's think now about the difference, right? Think about how we see the red square differently when the black square is not there versus how we see it when the black square is there. In design, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of design has to do with perceptual psychology, the way people see things, the way we perceive things, and how we process the information, the visual information of seeing. And I think a lot of it can be broken down into two basic rules, kind of the rule of relative contrast and the rule of a sympathetic association, where in terms of relative contrast, we tend to, and we've talked about this before, if you place a lot of large things around a small thing, the small thing might look even smaller. Um, but in this case, whoop, it feels a little bit like the opposite. If anything, the red square maybe seems a little bit bigger when it's paired with the black square, even though the black square is bigger than it. And I think the reason for that is that when it's on its own, we pair it compared just to the size of the whole composition. And so compared to the size of the whole composition, it seems, it seems smaller. If we think about its location, it seems, whoop, I keep going back the wrong direction. It seems maybe a little bit higher here with the black square. And I think that is definitely a sympathetic association where it feels like it's because it's close to this, they start to feel like a group, black square and red square. And therefore, and since black square is above mid-level, above midline, right, then red square seems like it's closer to midline than it does in the previous version, right? Um, and let's see, whereas in terms of value, I would definitely say it's much more an issue of relative contrast. The red feels just a little bit darker when it doesn't have the black there at all to associate with, to comparison with, whereas when it's black square and red square, the red square seems much more solidly in the mid-value range. Okay, so my point here is that if nothing else, design happens out of that sense, right? The fundamental aspect of design is that when you put a mark, right, on a blank surface, that does something, right? It creates potentials, it creates ideas. Your eye sees those things as like, ooh, maybe it's moving. And then you put another mark, and then that changes the things that you first created with the first mark. That's the fundamental absolute truth, I think, of all design. But everything else, all the rules, all the whether it's 7 principles or 12 principles, is negotiable. Okay, so one of my points here is that this whole notion of design, as compared to the way people thought about composition and making pictures, right, before the 20th century, this whole way of thinking of design as one single field that unifies how you design a teapot. This is a beautiful teapot, by the way, just gorgeous. Or how you design a graphic design piece, right? Or how you design a book cover, how you design a piece of architecture. That they all fundamentally share the same units of design, right? That's a very 20th century model that came out of 20th century thinkers. You know, we already talked about Rudolf Arnheim. He's definitely one of them, but also, you know, Gropius, a lot of the people of the Bauhaus, Itten, they all were working, developing this idea of how does design work, how does a picture work, and they were approaching it in a very specific way. Whereas if we look, and here's my first point, like if we think about when we've been talking about composition, we spent a lot of time talking about Baroque paintings because Baroque paintings tend to be composed in a very specific sort of way. And I want you to think about this contrast between the way people, artists of the Baroque and the people who looked at paintings and wrote about paintings in the Baroque period or slightly after the Baroque period, how they saw composition compared to the design movement, how in the early 20th century, how did those artists and those thinkers think of design, right? And you can see some similarities, right? Like both thought about value, but the Baroque thought of value in terms of light and shadow, right? Both thought about balance, but in design, it's much more about visual weight, right? Whereas balance in the Baroque is much more about the balance of everything, not just, you know, the balance of visual weight. So, and then, and think about how all of these things then tie to the overall differences of the point of view of Baroque art, what Baroque was trying to do. It's focused on drama, it's focused on narrative, right? Compared to these values. All right, that's my 1 minute warning. So, and this list here should probably be pretty familiar for you because that was in that document that I gave all of you to look at when you were writing your first comparison paper. Probably right about now you're thinking, man, I wish I'd heard this lecture as well as gotten that document. But take a look at these two paintings. Well, we don't have quite enough time, so I'll take a break now. I'll meet you at part 2.